Hi, this is Chris Converse, and in this episode we'll take a look at creating our own Mixin in Less. Mixins work a lot like functions in other languages like JavaScript and PHP and many others. They allow us to define some CSS properties and reuse and customize those properties for any number of other CSS rules in our document. Now if you'd like to follow along with me, download the exercise files and make sure to have a compiling tool running as well, so your Less file will be converted into CSS. And once you've extracted the exercise files, you'll see a style.less file. You'll also see a style.css file. It's this style.css file that the less file will be compiled into. There's an index.html file, an images folder with a banner.jpg graphic, and in my particular case, I have a CodeKit file. CodeKit is the compiling software that I'll be using to convert my less files into CSS. So you will not have this file in your exercise files. So to begin our project, let's open index.html in a text editor. Now inside of the HTML file in the head area, we have a link to the style.css file. Again, this is the compiled file from the less document. If I scroll down, inside of the body element, we have a header element and a main element. Inside of the main element, we have an article element and an aside element. Inside of the article and aside elements, we have anchor links with a class of btn. Now, in an earlier episode, we converted anchor links into buttons using CSS. So we're going to be using Mixins in Less to share some of those properties across the buttons inside of the article element and the button inside of the aside element. Now, if you'd like to preview the layout we're going to be working with, you can open the HTML file up in a browser. Inside of the browser, you'll see on the left-hand side here, the article element. We have our two anchor links that are being converted into buttons. And over in the aside, we can see the third button showing up over here. So now to begin creating our Mixin, let's go back to the exercise files and let's open up style.less in our text editor. So with our less file open, there is one thing I want to call your attention to before we start creating our Mixin. And that is, in an earlier episode, we created columns in a layout using the CSS calculation feature. However, one thing to keep in mind with a less file is that the less compiler will attempt to calculate that CSS calculation. So if I scroll down here and find the article selector, we have a width, and the original property was to calculate the width as being 100% and then subtracting 240 pixels. So in order to keep this value without the less compiler actually calculating this, we need to add a tilde before the calculation, and we need to have the calculation show up as a string. So we need to put either double quotes or single quotes around that calculation. Now I've already added this to the less file, but I wanted to call your attention to this in case you try to use other calculations inside of a less file. So with that taken care of, let's scroll down to the bottom. Let's find the selector of a.btn. Inside of here are all of the properties that convert those anchor links into buttons. So I want to reuse these properties in a Mixin and then reapply these to the links inside of the article and the aside. So for now, let's come in here and select all of these properties. Let's go to the edit menu. Let's choose cut. Then I'll just come in here and delete that rule. And let's now create a Mixin and then put the properties inside of the Mixin. So a Mixin inside of less starts with a period, then the name of the Mixin. So we'll call this button_normal. Put in a beginning and ending parenthesis, then a beginning and ending bracket. So again, this looks a lot like functions inside of a language like JavaScript. And then let's come in here and paste in all of those properties. Now with my Mixin in place, I'm going to hit save. If I go back to the browser now and hit reload, we'll see that all of the anchor links are now showing up as regular links. So we've basically lost all of the properties being assigned to those because these are all now inside of a Mixin. So now back inside of our less file, let's create rules that will reapply those properties back to those individual anchor links. So let's first start by targeting the anchor links inside of the article. So let's type article space a.btn, then a space. Let's put in our brackets. Scroll up here a little bit. And now inside of this CSS rule, to apply the Mixin, we'll simply type a period, type in button_normal, beginning and ending parenthesis, then a semicolon. Next, let's come up here and select this entire rule. Let's copy it. Let's hit a few returns. Let's paste it. And let's change article to aside. So now with these in place, let's save our less file. It'll get compiled. Let's go back to the browser. Let's hit reload. And we can now see that all of those properties are now being reassigned to the links inside of both the article and aside sections. So now that our Mixin is working properly, now let's create the option to create some customizable properties inside of our Mixin. So let's go back to our less file. Let's find button_normal. Let's go inside of the parentheses and let's add 3 properties that we're going to send to this particular Mixin. So the first one, we're going to name it text, and we'll use less variables. So we'll use an @ symbol, type in the word text, then a comma. Next, we'll send the background color. So let's come up here and type in @ symbol, type in background, and then finally we'll send the border color. So a comma, @ symbol, border. Now you can name these variables anything you want. I'm choosing to name these text, background, and border. Now inside of the Mixin, I'm going to come in here and add another property called color. This is going to be the color of the text. So I'll type color, colon, space, and the value is going to be this text variable. So I'll select this up here. Let's paste it down here. Hit a semicolon. Next, let's select the background variable name. Let's copy that. Let's come down here to the background color property. Let's replace the # and 3 Fs with the background variable. Then finally, let's come up here and copy the border variable. And let's come down here to the border property and replace the # and 3 Fs for the color with the border variable. So now with these in place, let's come down here to article space a.btn, and when we call the Mixin, we're going to need to send these 3 properties. So the text color for the buttons inside of the article element, I want to be white. So I'll type a # and 3 Fs inside of the parentheses, then a comma. For the background color, we're going to use a green color. So that's going to be a #, 8C for red, C4 for green, and 28 for blue. Then a comma, and we're going to use the same color for the border. So I'll come in here, copy that, and then paste it again. So these 3 values are going to be sent when we call the button normal Mixin. So now let's come down here to the aside. Let's find the button normal Mixin call down here. And we're going to set the text color here to a dark green. So #. We're going to use 72 for red, B0 for green, and 03 for blue. Then a comma. For the background color, we're going to use white. So that's a # and 3 Fs. And then for the border color, we're going to use white as well. So # and 3 Fs. So with these in place, let's hit save. The less file will be compiled to CSS. Let's go back to the browser. Let's hit reload. And we can now see that the buttons in the article element have some slightly different properties than the button over in the aside. However, there are a series of common properties being used, such as display, padding, border radius, and so forth. So now that we have some variations working in our Mixin for some of our properties, now we're going to create another Mixin so we can create some hover states. So let's go back to our less file. Now after the button normal Mixin, let's add another Mixin. So we'll type .button_hover. Put in our parentheses, put in our brackets, split this open on the brackets. Now the 2 properties we want to send to button hover will be just text and background. So I'll come up here and copy these 2 variable names. Let's come down here and paste them in the parentheses for our button hover Mixin. And now inside of our button hover Mixin, let's set some properties. First will be color. So color, colon, space. The value, we're going to set that to the text variable. And then next, we're going to set background color. And we're going to set that value to the background variable. And now with that in place, we need to assign hover selectors to our buttons. And we're going to do that by using the nesting feature of less, which we covered in an earlier episode as well. So let's come down here to article space a.btn. Let's hit a few returns. So to create a nested selector in less, we'll use an ampersand. Then we'll add a pseudo class of hover. So colon, hover, space, put in our brackets. And now inside of the selector, we need to call the button hover Mixin. So let's come up here and copy this. Come down here and paste it. Put in our parentheses and a semicolon. Now we're going to send 2 parameters inside of the parentheses here, one for the text color and one for the background. So for the text color, for the buttons inside of the article, we want that to be black. So we'll type a # and 3 zeros, then a comma. Then for the background color, we're going to set that to white. So that'll be a # and 3 Fs. Next, let's come up here and select this entire selector. Let's copy that. Let's come down inside of the aside space a.btn. I'll hit a few returns. Paste that down here. And the hover state for the aside, we're going to set the text color to white. So let's come in here and replace the # and 3 zeros with a # and 3 Fs. And for the background color, I want to use a semi-transparent white. So instead of a hash symbol, we're going to use the RGBA color space. So we'll type RGBA, beginning and ending parenthesis. Inside of the parentheses, to use white, we'll set red to 255, comma, 255 for green, comma, 255 for blue, comma, then 0.3 for the alpha. So we'll get a 30% white transparent background for the hover state of the button inside of the aside. So with all of these properties in place, let's save our work. Let's go back to the browser. Let's hit reload. And now we can come over here and hover over each one of the buttons and we'll see the different styles taking effect. Now the last thing I'd like to do is add a right-facing arrow to each one of the buttons. And we can do this by using the same nesting technique in the main button normal mixin. So let's go back to our less file. Scroll up here a little bit. After the background color property, I'll hit a few returns. Let's type in ampersand. Let's add a pseudo element. So we'll type in 2 colons, then the word after. Add in our brackets. We'll split this open. Inside of our pseudo element, the first thing we need to do is define the content. So we'll type content, colon space, 2 ticks and a semicolon. Inside of the ticks for the string, we want to use a right-facing arrow character. So we'll type a \, 25BA. Then the next property is going to be font size. We're going to set this to 0.8 ems. Next property is going to be padding left. We're going to set that to 6 pixels. And then finally, we're going to set the opacity to 0.65. So with these in place, we'll hit save again. And now since we nested this pseudo element into the button normal mixin, if we come back to the browser and hit reload, we'll now see that all of the buttons have the right-facing arrow being applied to them. Now, if you're curious to see how all of these less properties get compiled into CSS, we can go back to the exercise files, open style.css, scroll down to the bottom, you'll see all of the properties that were defined inside of the mixin being applied to all of the selectors in the final CSS file. And so now if you'd like to learn more about using less or Sass, I'd recommend taking Joe Marini's course entitled CSS with Less and Sass, which is also available here in the library. And so with that, I'll conclude this episode, and as always, thanks for watching.